Please give a warm welcome to Andrew Bacevich.
Well, that introduction is beyond generous. I guess my recollections of our Princeton days are somewhat different. Tom was a student of Arthur Link, primarily a Wilson scholar, the Wilson scholar, but also a great historian of American political history, American diplomatic history, a courtly man, devoted to his students and to his scholarship, and probably one of the most frightening individuals I've ever met in my entire life. And I think you may have felt the same in those early years when we learned from him. Well, I am going to talk about my most recent book. I think the talk will go for about 40 minutes, and I'll try to get through it as quickly as I can, because actually what you want to do is engage in kind of a little back and forth, and that's a lot more fun for me, too. But let me sort of jump right into the text, and you tell me what you think.
It's not.
How's that sound? Is that any better? For well over 30 years now, the United States military has been intensively engaged in various quarters of the Islamic world, and an end to that involvement is nowhere in sight. Tick off the countries in that region that U.S. forces in recent decades have invaded, occupied, garrisoned, bombed, or raided, and where American soldiers have killed or been killed. Since 1980, they include Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, but also Iran, Lebanon, Libya, Turkey, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Syria, Jordan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, the southern Philippines, and most recently Niger. The list just keeps getting longer. To judge by the various official explanations coming out of Washington, the mission of the troops dispatched to these various quarters has been to defend or deter or liberate, punishing the wicked and protecting the innocent while spreading liberal values and generally keeping us safe. Well, what are we to make of the enterprise in which the United States has been engaged now for well over 3 decades? What is the nature of the military struggle that we are waging? What should we call it? For several years after 9/11, Americans referred to it as the global war on terrorism, a misleading term that has since fallen out of favor. For a brief period, during the early years of the George W. Bush administration, certain neoconservatives promoted the term World War IV. This never caught on, however, in part because, unlike other major conflicts in U.S. history, to include the Cold War that neocons considered World War III, this conflict found the American people sitting passively on the sidelines. With interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan dragging on inconclusively, some military officers in the middle of the last decade began referring to what they called the Long War. And while nicely capturing the temporal dimension of the conflict, this label had nothing to say about purpose, adversary, or location. And as with World War IV, the long war never gained much traction outside of military circles. Well, here's another possibility. Since 1980, back when President Jimmy Carter promulgated the Carter Doctrine, the United States has been engaged in what we should rightfully call America's war for the greater Middle East. The premise that underlies this war can be simply stated. With disorder, dysfunction, and disarray centered in the Islamic world, posing a growing threat to vital U.S. national security interests, the adroit application of hard power ought to enable the United States to check those tendencies and thereby foster conditions conducive to U.S. interests and to our well-being. So choose whatever term you like: police, pacify, shape, control, dominate, transform. Back in 1980, President Carter launched the United States on a project aimed at nothing less than determining the fate and future of the peoples inhabiting the Ark of Nations, from West Africa and the Maghreb all the way across the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf to Central Asia. Now, since the end of World War II, American soldiers had fought and died in East Asia. Even when the wars in Korea and Vietnam ended, U.S. troop contingents continued to garrison that region. In Europe, a major U.S. military presence dating from the start of the Cold War signaled Washington's willingness to fight there as well. Yet prior to Carter's watershed 1980 statement, no comparable U.S. commitment toward the Islamic world existed. And now that was going to change. Only in retrospect does this become clear, of course. At the time when President Carter declared the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest, that's the meaning of the Carter Doctrine, certainly Carter himself did not intend to embark upon a war. Nor did he anticipate what course the war was going to follow, its duration, costs, and consequences. Like the European statesman who just over 100 years ago touched off the cataclysm we know today as World War I, Carter merely lit a fuse without knowing where it led. But he and his successors initiated a sequence of military actions, some large, some small, some brief, others protracted, that deserve collective recognition as a war. Questions raised by this undertaking will preoccupy and, I believe, confound scholars for decades to come. In my remarks this evening, I'll limit myself to four of the most fundamental. First, what motivated the United States to act as it has? Second, what had the civilians responsible for formulating policy and the soldiers charged with implementing policy sought to accomplish? Third, regardless of their intentions, what actually occurred? And fourth, with what consequences? Well, what at the outset was the purpose of this undertaking? The United States embarked upon its war for the greater Middle East in order to preserve the American way of life. The United States embarked upon its war for the greater Middle East to assure access to Persian Gulf oil. Both of those statements are true. Back in 1980, the American way of life required bountiful supplies of cheap oil. Even today, whether for good or ill, that remains the case. Back in 1980, unlike today, the approaching depletion of once plentiful North American fossil fuel reserves appeared to be an irreversible fact of life. The implications of that apparent fact, driven home to the American consumer by the successive oil shocks of the 1970s vaulted the Persian Gulf into the first tier of U.S. geopolitical interests. So just as the American Civil War was about slavery, America's war for the greater Middle East from the very outset has been about oil. Of course, slavery alone does not define all that divided North and South. At stake was not simply whether people of color should be held in bondage, but which political, economic, and social arrangements were to shape the American future. Similarly, from the outset, oil alone does not explain what drew the United States militarily into the greater Middle East. At stake were the expectations of limitlessness that many Americans take to be part of their birthright. Now, during the 1960s and 1970s, the United States had seemingly run headlong into limits. In Vietnam, it encountered a war that it could not win. At home, the golden age of post-war prosperity sputtered to an end. Americans back then, in the 60s and 70s, confronted low growth, high inflation, and industrial decline. The oil shocks were the icing on an unpalatable cake. The war for the greater Middle East was one expression of a collective determination to affirm the singularity of the United States as a nation not bound by the constraints that others were obliged to respect. In September 2001, with the conflict already in its third decade, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld took it upon himself to make explicit the rationale that until that moment had been largely implicit. We have a choice, Rumsfeld explained. We have a choice, either to change the way we live, which is unacceptable, or to change the way they live. And we chose the latter. So just as prior victories in 1865 and 1945 had enabled Americans to create that way of life, so too victory in the greater Middle East would enable Americans to preserve it, thereby affirming the status of the United States as exceptional and indispensable. Such, at least, was the expectation. Well, the resulting war for the greater Middle East divides into 4 phases, or perhaps I should say 4 phases thus far. Phase 1 began in 1980 with the failed Iran hostage rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw, and Phase 1 ended in 1991 with Operation Provide Comfort, the U.S.-led effort to assist the Iraqi Kurds, evidence that the ostensible victory achieved earlier that year in Operation Desert Storm was actually serving chiefly to draw the U.S. military more deeply into the greater Middle East. In the interim, that is between 1980 and 1991, an ill-conceived peacekeeping enterprise in Lebanon had ended with the disastrous Beirut bombing of October 1983, 241 Americans killed in a single day. And it included inconsequential jousting with Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, which culminated with a terrorist attack that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103, killing all on board. Meanwhile, still during Phase 1, during the first Gulf War, I want you to keep track of how many Gulf Wars there have been. During the first Gulf War, that is to say the war pitting Iraq against Iran, running from 1980 to 1988, during the first Gulf War, the United States intervened both covertly and overtly on behalf of Saddam Hussein even as the Reagan administration was secretly and illegally providing weapons to Iran. Go figure. In Afghanistan, meanwhile, covert U.S. support for jihadists attempting to oust Soviet occupiers ended in a celebrated Cold War victory, that is to say, a great victory in the Cold War, which thereby wrecked Afghanistan itself. And thus did this victory create conditions leading to the rise of the Taliban, while encouraging radical Islamists like Osama bin Laden in the belief that superpowers could be had. When Saddam Hussein responded to the end of his war with Iran by invading and annexing neighboring Kuwait in 1990, Reagan's successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, assembled a massive coalition that restored Kuwaiti sovereignty in a campaign that, for a time, seemed to be a military masterpiece. Appearances deceived, however. This second Gulf War left many loose ends. Although the troops were properly treated to homecoming parades, the truth was that they weren't going to be coming home anytime soon. Things were just warming up. Indeed, the principal legacy of the Second Gulf War was to loosen any remaining constraints on Washington's inclination to use military power. So that by the time Phase 1 ended in 1991, the United States had committed itself militarily to the greater Middle East on multiple occasions in multiple places. Yet neither Carter nor Reagan nor the elder Bush had devised anything remotely like a strategy to guide policy. In Washington, the coherent vision of what exactly the United States was trying to accomplish simply did not exist. So Phase 2 of America's war for the Greater Middle East began in 1992, when the elder Bush ordered U.S. forces to intervene in Somalia. And it ended a decade later in 2002, when his son prematurely abandoned Afghanistan, assuming that overthrowing the Taliban meant that the U.S. had finished with that country. Had finished with that country back in 2002. In the interim, that is to say between 1992 and 2002, what had begun as a humanitarian intervention on behalf of starving Somalis morphed into an urban insurgency culminating in humiliating withdrawal when the notorious Black Hawk Down incident persuaded Bill Clinton to cut his losses. Here was a warning, completely ignored, of the backlash awaiting U.S. efforts to remake societies radically different from our own. Bill Clinton did fare somewhat better in two successive Balkan interventions on behalf of besieged Muslim minorities, first in Bosnia and then in Kosovo. U.S.-led air campaigns, followed by U.S.-led occupations, enabled Bosnian Muslims and then Kosovars to achieve their political aims, albeit without improving Washington's standing in the broader Islamic world. We didn't win many points. Of greater significance in the Balkan campaigns were the unintended consequences of the so-called dual containment policy, inaugurated by the elder Bush and then sustained by Clinton. Containing both Iraq and Iran in the 1990s required the permanent stationing of substantial U.S. forces near or in the Persian Gulf, notably in Saudi Arabia. Low-level hostilities with Iraq continued throughout the decade. That is to say, with very few of us taking notice, the Second Gulf War continued. Bin Laden took offense and declared war on the United States. Sporadic attacks on U.S. assets ensued in Saudi Arabia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Yemen. Clinton responded in desultory fashion with a handful of missile strikes. Bin Laden was unimpressed. The ineffectiveness of this preliminary U.S. campaign against al-Qaeda then became fully manifest in September 2001 with the devastating attacks on New York and Washington. George W. Bush, now president, responded by immediately declaring a global war on terrorism. Yet what followed began less as a global war than as an effort to punish Afghans for having given sanctuary to al-Qaeda. The preliminary stages of Operation Enduring Freedom, that was the intervention in Afghanistan that began in the fall of 2001, the preliminary stages were dramatic and daring, but ultimately inconclusive. U.S. forces scattered, but failed to destroy al-Qaeda and the Taliban. By the time Phase 2 ended, however, U.S. military intervention in the greater Middle East has become routine. Now, in 2002-2003, now for the first time since that war began, Washington devised a strategy, which the Bush administration marketed under the label Freedom Agenda. The third Gulf War, begun in 2003, and lasting until 2011, was meant to jumpstart the process of transforming those countries that served as breeding grounds of anti-American violence. Here, the United States set out to change the way they live. A war aim qualifying as either noble or preposterous, depending on one's point of view. But this was the vision that animated U.S. actions during Phase 3 of America's war for the greater Middle East. Now, as a venue to begin implementing a strategy that aimed to change the way they live, Saddam Hussein's Iraq appeared uniquely attractive. True, Iraq had had nothing to do with 9/11, but Saddam Hussein had made his country an international pariah, virtually without allies and without sympathizers. The Iraqi army was not likely to pose a significant opposition, having amply demonstrated its incompetence, even before taking into account the effects of periodic U.S. bombing, along with a decade of crippling sanctions. That the Iraqi people were largely secular, upwardly mobile, and united in their yearning for liberation, a fanciful image nursed in the upper reaches of the Bush administration, all of this figured as a bonus. In other words, what made it imperative to invade Iraq was not the danger Iraq posed, but the opportunity it presented. Yet although the invaders quickly got to Baghdad and overthrew the Saddam Hussein regime, they proved unable to assert control of the country. Indeed, by their very presence, U.S. forces incited and then found themselves enveloped by a complex, multi-sided conflict that was part civil war, part ancient sectarian squabble, and part anti-Western jihad. We may argue about the date of the demise of the Freedom Agenda. Certainly by late 2006, however, it had collapsed. Rather than a springboard, Iraq had become a dead end. And Phase 3 of America's war for the greater Middle East thereby ended. Phase 4 commenced, but once more devoid of any unifying sense of purpose. To effect a salvage operation, President Bush hired a new field commander, David Petraeus. This yielded the so-called surge of 2007-2008, creating conditions allowing the United States to withdraw from Iraq without having to acknowledge outright defeat. And this it did. In December 2011, President Barack Obama, keeping to a schedule for withdrawal that his predecessor had established. Turning his attention back to the much slighted war in Afghanistan, Obama, ironically, sought to apply there the very methods that he had faulted Bush for employing in Iraq. He organized an Afghanistan surge, applying the very same counterinsurgency techniques that had supposedly made the Iraq surge such a success. The results there proved to be a bit of a bust, however. In June of 2011, while announcing the forthcoming U.S. withdrawal, or the forthcoming withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, President Obama said, quote, "We take comfort in knowing that the tide of war is receding." In fact, however, the tide was not receding. Even as Obama was struggling to extricate the United States from Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. military activities in other quarters of the Islamic world were actually expanding. Indeed, the Obama administration's chief contribution to the ongoing war for the Greater Middle East was to enlarge it. Prior to 9/11, the abiding defect of U.S. military policy in the Islamic world had been naivete. After 9/11, it became hubris. Now, during phase 4 of the war for the Greater Middle East, the problem was one of diffusion. The principal beneficiaries of phase 4 were special operations forces and anyone able to carve out a piece of the action associated with unmanned aerial vehicles. For policymakers seeking to punish without complications associated with wholesale invasion and occupation, commandos and drones offered a host of benefits. And these now emerged as the American weapons of choice. Varying according to purpose, the Obama-era campaigns fell into 3 distinct categories. In some, the aim was to depose. In others, to suppress. In others, still simply to retard. All shared a common determination to minimize risks, keep down costs, and above all, avoid anything approximating a quagmire. Including in the first category, depose, was direct intervention in Libya and indirect intervention in Syria. The second category, suppress, included recurring military actions in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. The third category, retard, expanded America's war for the Greater Middle East into Africa, the Pentagon calculating that a modest U.S. military presence there could nip violent jihad in the bud. Regardless of intended purpose, little of this activity produced the desired result. Yet overall, the number of active fronts in America's war for the Greater Middle East multiplied. This was President Bush's principal contribution to that war. President Obama's principal contribution. Providing some thread of continuity linking these various operations was a theory of decapitation. Targeting leaders seemed to offer some prospect of keeping at bay threats to the United States that flourished in the most disordered parts of the Greater Middle East. But what if U.S. drone strikes and special operations raids were creating more anti-American jihadists than they were eliminating? What if the leaders replacing those that U.S. forces killed turned out to be more vicious than their predecessors? Or Darwinian process serving to strengthen the species? These questions defied easy answers. But transcending in significance the Obama administration's penchant for raids and assassination was a fourth Gulf War, dating from 2013, which rendered a definitive verdict on the third Gulf War. Because when tested, the new U.S.-created Iraqi order proved unable to stand on its own, its manifest shortcomings drawing the United States into yet another round of fighting. Further complicating this situation was the evolving situation in neighboring Syria. There, an ongoing civil war morphed into a multi-sided affair involving a new entity bent on carving out of Syria and Iraq the beginnings of a new pan-Islamic caliphate. This new entity, variously referred to as ISIS or ISIL or simply the Islamic State, aimed to demolish the state system created by early 20th century Europeans who had reconfigured the greater Middle East to suit their own imperial purposes. By President Obama's second term, however, Americans had pretty much exhausted their enthusiasm for rescuing Iraq. Furthermore, it was not self-evident that ISIS posed an immediate danger to the United States itself. It was in December 2013 that ISIS seized Fallujah and emerged from al-Qaeda's shadows. Early the following month, the organization's supreme leader declared the founding of a new caliphate and pronounced himself caliph. Worse was still to come. It's not a worry, but this is why I don't have a cell phone. That's not an applause line. I used to have one about 6 weeks ago. The only time I ever used it was on a trip like this, and I'd use it to call my wife. Say, honey, I got to Dallas. And I said to myself, I'm paying like $38 a month. It was only a flip phone. I was paying $38 a month, and I was making like 5 calls a month. I'm saying, what am I doing? I refuse to have a smartphone. I think they are the work of the devil. So I got rid of my flip phone, and now when I get to Dallas, I send her an email. I say, honey, I got here. I'm doing fine. See you tomorrow. That's right. Oh! Don't worry about it. Worse was still to come. We just talked about the fall of Fallujah. Worse was still to come. In June of 2014, fewer than 1,000 ISIS fighters captured Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, with Iraqi defenders, 2 whole divisions offering alarmingly little resistance. In Washington, as a result, something akin to panic set in. And on August 7th, President Obama announced the beginning of a new U.S. air campaign against the Islamic State, even as he assured Americans, quote, I will not allow the United States to be dragged into fighting another war in Iraq, end of quote. Now, for people of my age, in the American military lexicon, mission creep is a term of opprobrium, redolent with connotations similar to Vietnam's gradual escalation. Well, as the Obama administration was approaching its end, the mission was unquestionably creeping. Now, ISIS enjoyed military successes early on, not because ISIS fighters were strong, but because the Iraqi army created by the United States was ill-trained and poorly led. ISIS fighters were certainly zealous and willing to die for their cause. But ISIS had no weapons of mass destruction, no air force, no navy, few heavy weapons, and only the most precarious resource base. That is to say, as a conventional force, ISIS was very weak. This became evident late in Obama's second term when the U.S. orchestrated a counteroffensive, led by U.S. Special Operations Forces, with Iraqis and Kurds doing most of the actual fighting on the ground, generously supported, promiscuously supported by American air power. That counteroffensive, sustained by President Trump, slowly reduced the territory controlled by the Islamic State, so that by the end of 2017, the state as a state had virtually ceased to exist. The movement, however, survives. In the meantime, U.S. forces had entered Syria, which was being ripped apart by a vicious, multi-sided civil war, one that was engaging the attention of Iran, Turkey, Russia, and Israel, as well as the United States. Now, why the United States should have any interest in the Syrian civil war is unclear, at least to me. What does seem increasingly clear is that U.S. forces will remain in Syria in some capacity for the foreseeable future. So 38 years after Jimmy Carter signed off on the Carter Doctrine, the prospects of the United States actually winning its war for the greater Middle East and bringing the troops home do not appear especially bright. In the presidential election campaign of 2016, Donald Trump was the one candidate who dared to say that out loud. As president, however, Trump, even if reluctantly, has chosen to perpetuate that war for the greater Middle East on a slightly larger scale, everywhere from the Horn of Africa to Afghanistan. So where does that leave us? By almost any measure, the region today is less stable and more dangerous than it was in 1980. Not only are American purposes unfulfilled, they're becoming increasingly difficult to define with any sort of specificity. How then shall we assess America's war for the greater Middle East? Well, we have not won it. In my estimation, we are not winning it. To expect that simply pressing on will produce more positive results next year or the year after is simply to ignore all that has occurred over the past several decades. Regarding America's war for the greater Middle East, we can say only one thing with certainty. It will not end anytime soon. It has become self-perpetuating. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was an enormously insightful, stimulating talk. Lots to think about. We have Blake and Brian with microphones, if you will. Professor Bacevich will call on you and wait for the mic to come to you so everybody can hear your question.
And the only additional rule that will follow is to have absolute gender balance. So if the first questioner, is that you, sir?
Yes, sir.
The first questioner is a male, and the second one has to be a woman. So think about that. Yes, sir.
I would agree with that. It has been said, or at least I recall reading it, and perhaps the origin of what I'm about to ask came...
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. The origin of the question I was about to ask, or the thesis behind it is, and I thought it came from Henry Kissinger, was that to leave Saddam Hussein in power would pose a dagger, in quotes, at the throat of the Khomeini regime and its successors, one country sort of neutralizing the other in terms of creating a balance of power. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that was the logic that shaped U.S. policy toward what I referred to as the first Gulf War. When the United States provided very substantial support to the Saddam Hussein regime, this is during the Reagan presidency, it's not because President Reagan or his advisors were kidding themselves about Saddam Hussein being a good guy. Saddam Hussein had initiated that war. It was a land grab by Iraq at the expense of Iran. And as with so many people when they start a war, the assumption was we're going to win and we're going to win quickly and cheaply. And as so often is the case, that turned out not to be the case. And indeed, after a period of time, it began to appear that Iran would win that war, and that Iran would therefore be in a position to assert hegemony over the Persian Gulf. And it was that then induced the United States to intervene on Saddam's behalf in a variety of ways. So there was a period of time when the idea was to try to use our power and influence to maintain some sort of balance. I think then it was the third Iraq War, that is to say, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, that tended to sort of blow that concept away and persuaded the elder President Bush that we were going to have to intervene on such a large scale. I don't for a second believe that the elder President Bush, any more than Carter, anticipated the consequences of that kind of an intervention. You remember, after the war was over, he believed, I think genuinely believed, that the battlefield victory that the United States had achieved in January and February of 1991, right, was so complete and so dramatic that demonstration of American military prowess would set the stage for what he called a new world order. The problem there is that the victory was not as great as it appeared at first glance. Crucially, Saddam Hussein managed to maintain himself in power. And that fact, along with ensuing developments such as the uprising by Shiites and Kurds that was violently suppressed, led to the decision to transform the American military posture from one essentially of being offshore and prepared to intervene as needed. The new posture became one of maintaining a more or less permanent and substantial U.S. military presence. And that offended a hell of a lot of people. Is that an okay answer? Or should we ask another person to? Well, he stayed in power. Okay, the first one is 1980 to 88. The second one is 1990.
Then the third. The one that took place under
The younger Bush. I think I get the logic of what you're proposing, but what you're proposing would have required the Bush administration to pivot so dramatically in its representation of what the Saddam Hussein regime represented. And it would also have required them to abandon their strategic vision. Because in 2003, it's a document that's worth reading is the U.S. National Security Strategy of 2002, published just prior to George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. The mindset of the Bush administration, I think, very much endorsed, not simply by neoconservatives, but also by sort of militaristic liberals. The mindset was one that assumed that we could transform that country and the rest of the region. We weren't interested in stability at that point. What we were interested in is slaying the evildoers, liberating the oppressed, and establishing liberal democracies beginning in Iraq and going elsewhere. So in retrospect, given the failure of the freedom agenda, one might say, in retrospect, would it not have been wiser to have more limited objectives in 2003? Maybe so, but that does not reflect people's attitude at the time. Yes, ma'am. We are good. We're off and running now. It's breaking through the first one that's a problem. I know you're thinking of a question. Aren't you? Oh, okay.
Are we going to start down the same route in China with North Korea and Japan, protecting Japan?
No, we're not. In other words, could one imagine, certainly not this president, but even this president's successor, whoever that might be, could one imagine the next president embracing a freedom agenda with regard to East Asia and attempting to use American military power to liberate China and North Korea? And I think I'm a believer, and I would like to say, please God, do not allow that to happen. Because China is a hell of a big country. What we got, 1.2 billion people, and lo and behold, is it our biggest or second biggest trading partner? Where will I buy socks if anything disrupts our relationship with China? So it seems to me, and this is not to dismiss the concern that informs your question. I mean, one of my gripes about this never-ending war for the greater Middle East is that I am persuaded that what goes on in that part of the world is less important to the well-being of our country and to the stability of the planet than things that are going on elsewhere. And as long as President Trump, God bless President Trump, just the other day stated publicly, and more or less accurately for him, stated publicly that in the last 17 years, we've spent $7 trillion pursuant to the war I just described. That, I believe that was a tweet. And the president said we haven't got a damn thing. And I think that's a fair judgment. What's more important than the greater Middle East? Both from a selfish point of view and I think from a point of sort of enlightened self-interest. I've come to believe climate change is more important. I am more concerned about cyber threats than I am about some Taliban operative trying to attack me and my family. I'm quite concerned about our ability to ensure stability in East Asia given the rise of China, given the antagonism between some of the principal actors in that part of the world, notably antagonism between China and Japan. Now, it's true, there are smart people scholars, policymakers who were working these issues. But I think it's also true that the attention of the country, phrase it differently, that those problems have not gotten the attention from this country that they deserve. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, is because we've been preoccupied and spending all our damn money, trying to sort out problems that are probably beyond our ability to solve. Yes, sir. I'll bring a mic over here.
It seems to me that anytime you're talking about the United States' ongoing involvement in the Near and Middle East, that there's always an elephant in the room. And that's the United States military economic support for the policies of the successive Israeli governments. I'm not talking about support for Israel, I'm talking about support for the government policies that do cause a lot of division in the Middle East and Near East and within Israeli politics as a whole. And I'd just like for you to comment on that involvement.
Well, no doubt about it, I think. I think our relationship with Israel has, I don't believe in its current state it serves the interests of the United States or it serves the interests of the state of Israel. And in particular, that applies in spades to the current Israeli government, which intervenes in our politics in ways that Vladimir Putin can't even imagine. And I'm troubled by that. That said, 2 points. First is, I don't for a second buy into the argument made by some, I'm not saying you made the argument, but made by some that somehow Israel controls U.S. policy in the region. I don't believe that for a second. It influences, again, I think it influences in ways that are not particularly helpful. But, and there is an Israel lobby, no doubt about it, but it's not like they own everything. And the second point would be, I think I'm, these days, even more troubled by the relationship between the United States and the Saudi monarchy than I am between the United States and the Netanyahu government. I mean, I am baffled by this radical tilt in favor of Saudi Arabia in its in its rivalry with Iran. Seems to me if you take a longer view, I'm not a Middle East hand, but if you take a longer view, Iran is actually it is the representative or the latest it's a civilization, for God's sakes. It's a culture. It's been around for centuries. It's got literature. It's got art. It has a predominantly young population. That every bit of evidence we have suggests that younger Iranians are oriented toward the West. They want their country to be they don't want their country to be stuck in the 14th century. What's the likelihood that the mullahs, who are a problem for us, that they're going to continue to govern Iran 20 years from now, 50 years from now? I don't know. But if I was a betting man, I'd put my bet on the young people who are energetic, numerous, and seem to know what they want. Saudi Arabia is not a civilization. It's a family. It's a rich family. And maybe this crown prince, what do we call him, MBS, seems to be an energetic fellow who's got a particular vision, who wants to change the country, wants to modernize it, God bless him. But it doesn't seem to me that if you try to figure out of the two countries, which is a more natural fit, I think it's Iran. I'm not trying to question for a second that the Iranian government in the past 30 years has done all kinds of nasty, mischievous things. They're not our friend. But we need to be playing a longer game, it seems to me, than we have been. And I'm also not trying to suggest that we should sort of tell the Saudis to take a hike and we'll go and try to embrace the Iranians. My actual view is that we are better off trying to take a somewhat detached and more balanced attitude toward the various powers in that region. Don't kid ourselves that we have the capacity to shape the region, to sort of bring it into alignment with our own values. That's, I think, ludicrous. But nor do we want to get in bed with Saudi Arabia any more than we already have. So it baffles me, this turn in U.S. policy that seems pretty evident since Trump became president. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Next one.
I'm curious what your thoughts are, what would happen if we simply left the Middle East? If we simply stopped being at war with everybody and everyone in every country in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, the honest answer is, I don't know, nor can anybody know. And of course, to withdraw militarily doesn't mean necessarily to disengage. It doesn't mean to turn our back on the region. It is, however, to recognize that the military instrument as we have used it has proved to be counterproductive. So, I mean, oh yeah, let's pull the troops out. Are there any other means available which can enable us to try to advance our interests, perhaps contribute to repairing some of the damage we have done, nudging things back in the direction where there would be some semblance of mutual coexistence? I think the answer is, yeah, there are things we can do. Whether we're talking diplomacy, whether we're talking economics, whether we're talking culture and education. Now, efforts made in that realm don't necessarily produce dramatic results overnight, as we always think military action is going to do. But I would argue strongly that A, it probably cost a hell of a lot less money, and B, over time, working patiently without making grandiose claims about what we're able to do, I think a non-military approach to strategy is more likely to produce positive results than what we've been doing for the past almost 4 decades.
Take one more question.
Oh, we have to do 2 because I promised this young woman that she'd get a chance, but we're on the male side at this point. Yes, sir, in the back, in the glasses. Now, the gentleman who's just standing up, who doesn't have a microphone.
I'll try to speak loud. Here it comes, sir. You pass that down. In a book recently published by a young scholar named Joshua Bandock called The Politics of Place, he shows that Montesquieu, who is quoted more frequently by our founding fathers than any other political philosopher, argued that democracy, to be successful, needs to take into account the specificity of environment, economics, culture, religion, the whole range of what makes one country different from another. And do you think that America thinking that one size fits all has misled America into some of these situations, rather than attempting to help each country realize a form of democracy that best suits its own particular needs?
Yes, I do. No, I mean, no, this certainly was true in the George W. Bush administration, at least in my estimation. That is that they were infatuated with ideology. infatuated with the notion that our values are universal values and that the world is out there hankering to embrace our values if we just sort of help out a little bit by getting rid of the bad guys. I think it's been a source of great mischief, and I regret it. But there you go. Madam, you get the last question. Okay. Here, come on, you might use my mic.
Well, I wanted to ask you, we touched on it, or you touched on it a few times, talking about youth and sort of a non-military way forward. What did you think of the Arab Spring? Is it still a thing? Did it really get squished? And why didn't the U.S. sort of jump on it and see it as a non-military way forward to significantly influence young populations throughout the Middle East?
Well, I mean, why did it fail? I think I should say, like, for the fourth time, I'm not a Middle East expert. You know, my knowledge of Egyptian culture and history would fit on the back of a postcard. But as an observer of the Arab Spring, I think it failed because what the uprising had in terms of spontaneity and energy, and those were enormously impressive, it lacked in terms of organization, strategy, and purpose. And therefore, the forces of order were able to crush them. Why didn't the United States do more? I think the Obama administration, I think President Obama probably, in a sense, wished he could do more. But it would have been an enormously bold and risky proposition. And President Obama was not a risk taker. And I say bold in the sense that, okay, are we for overthrowing autocratic governments? Would that include the Saudis and the Egyptians, the King of Jordan? And what would be the implications of that for U.S. national security interests? So in the long arc of U.S., I don't know if my friend Tom would agree with this, in the long arc of U.S. foreign policy, although we have consistently talked a good game with regard to democracy promotion, our actual support of political change leading to liberalism and democracy has been selective and has tended to occur only when there is a strong perception that democratic change will coincide with American geopolitical interests. That's a long-winded way of saying, when push comes to shove, we prefer order to disorder in the world. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.